Do you have anxiety? Yeah, anxiety exists for a reason. It's actually adaptive.
Hey there, how's it going? This is James Tripp. Title of this video is, Does Fear Keep You Safe? Now, the reason it's the title of the video is because that is the topic we are discussing. Up front of this video, you will have seen a clip of Abigail Schrier taken from her recent conversation with Joe Rogan that's out on the Joe Rogan Experience. They're in conversation about therapy in general, about mental health culture, and whether or not that is always a good thing, whether there's a downside to it. I think it's a very interesting conversation, very thought-provoking. And I'm going to actually be having a conversation on the Agents of Everything podcast with my good friend Dr. Paul Leslie on that very topic at another point in the future, but that's not what we're looking at in this video. I'm particularly interested in this video on some of the things that she said about anxiety and fear. Okay, she's talking about anxiety specifically. I'm going to use the term fear here because I often use that term as a sort of blanket term for any activation of our threat response systems.
This video is sponsored by the forthcoming live online training, Creating Courage and Fearlessness. This is a program for you if you feel you've been laying low or hanging back in life due to either overt, strong activations of your threat response systems or just those subtle activations, that quiet voice that talks you out of doing the things that you really want to do. If you're interested in this program, you can check out the details on the link.
Now, I did a recent podcast on this, Agents of Everything, where I was talking about the activation of the threat response systems, talking about fear, how that works from an evolutionary perspective. So I go into a lot more depth there, but I want to address specifically what Abigail Schrier is saying here, because one of the single biggest objections when I'm working with people to rewire their threat response systems, let's say, when they have a lot of debilitating fear or anxiety or stuff that's having them hang back in life rather than stride forward, lay low rather than rise up. Oftentimes people hold on to their fears and they hold on to their anxieties because they believe, it's almost like they fear that if they let go of their fear of something, they fear that that thing is more likely to happen because they let go of the fear. Simple way of putting it, they think the fear is keeping them safe. They really believe it. They really believe the anxiety is keeping them safe, or the thought processes at least that create it. So I want to take a look at that. First of all, let's take a look at what Abigail Schrier has to say in full on this particular topic of anxiety, obviously not the full podcast, and then we'll come back and address some of the points.
Anxiety exists for a reason. It's actually adaptive. And so there are benefits to anxiety and there are negative parts of anxiety. Now, I'm not talking about anxiety disorder. We don't want anyone to have an anxiety disorder that interferes with daily life. But a little anxiety, that's not only part of life, but it can have positive effects. So some of the positive effects of anxiety is it helps with performance. If I weren't nervous for this right now, I wouldn't have prepared so much to make sure I remembered what I was going to talk about, right? And we don't want someone with no anxiety crossing a street because he's not going to look for cars.
Right. That's a very important thing what you just said about experience anxiety. It actually helps you be sharper. You have to be nervous before you do things.
That's right.
That are difficult. It's just that uncomfortable feeling people avoid.
Right.
Because they get scared of the anxiety. But one of the best examples is UFC fighters. UFC fighters, before they're all nervous. They're all scared. Every one of them. Terrified. Right. And they don't want to fight if they're not. If you're too calm and too relaxed, you actually have bad performances.
So first thing I want to say here is I really appreciate something that Abigail Schrier is doing, and a lot of other people do, and I do this as well in my own work, which is to help people come to understand that fear and anxiety, or whatever you want to call it here, is in fact a natural thing. Right? It's not something that is a disorder, right? It doesn't mean you have a mental health issue or anything like this. It is a natural human thing. It's the product of a healthy mammalian brain in a lot of ways. So I've mentioned this elsewhere, but we come into the world with these threat response systems. They're largely unwired, and we end up wiring them up in such a way. And the point of that is to keep us safe. We are the product of millions of years of evolution. Many generations have gone before us. And the people that have gone before us all survived. And part of what the intelligence of evolution has bestowed upon us in terms of survival mechanisms are threat response systems. So they can seem like, if we take it on face value, they're a good thing. They're always a good thing. There's no pathological side to them, and that's absolutely true. The reason this is important to realize is because it doesn't help people if they have, I shall say, maladaptive threat response patterns, and I'll come back to that term specifically. It doesn't help people to think that there's something terribly wrong with them, right? That there's some kind of mental health issue or anything like that. It doesn't serve them, right? The human brain, the mammalian brain, is highly adaptive. We come into the world with our threat response systems largely unwired, but with certain tendencies, and we wire them up because we are adaptive, right? We adapt to the world. So the question isn't whether it's pathological, whether it's good, whether it's bad, it's whether it's adaptive or maladaptive. Now in this clip, Abigail Schrier has said that fear or anxiety, she's talking about specifically here, is adaptive. It is potentially adaptive. In the broadest sense, it's adaptive, but it can also become maladaptive. And a good example of this, I might actually do a separate video on this. I came across this BBC article talking about selective mutism and somebody's personal experience of selective mutism. And when people hear that term, selective mutism, they often think about that as, well, I'm just choosing who I talk to or who I don't. But it gives a good description of this person's experience of literally them shutting down, their mouth won't move, and there are no words in their mind to say to people. And it's an anxiety response. Okay, now if you think about threat response systems, they kick off, and I often use this selection of 6: fight, flight, freeze, hide, avoid, submit. Yes, that's all about keeping you safe. But if you're freezing, right, which she's freezing in terms of her ability to speak and her ability to think, there's a very strong anxiety response. It's one that I actually have experienced with in my past, back when I had a lot of heavy anxiety, maladaptive anxiety, let's say, kicking off. That's not helpful. Right? It's not really keeping this person safe. They've got caught up in an idea that there is threat in opening their mouth and speaking. They've got caught up in an idea that there is serious threat contained within the potential judgment of others, and there are certain judgments that are going to be being feared. Now, whilst we can say in general, yes, threat response systems, the fact that we have them, that is a useful evolutionary adaptation, but how we have them wired up in our lives can be more or less adaptive when looked at in terms of the kind of life we want to live, what we want to create in the world, how we want to be in the world, right? Now, the thing is, I think most people can make a call on their own fear and anxiety. Okay, they can make a judgment call. They can step back and look at it and go, how is this serving me? How are my threat responses serving me? Are they really, in aggregate, keeping me safe, or are they actually just stopping me achieving the things I want to achieve? Now, by the time most people seek any kind of assistance, any kind of coaching or therapy or whatever around doing something about their overactivation of threat response systems, they've already made the decision that it's maladaptive. Right? And that's not a bad thing. It's less useful if they've decided there's something terribly wrong with them, to say that there's some kind of awful human being because of this. That's not useful. It is a very human thing. It's just that their threat response systems have got wired up a particular way, and now they're choosing to do the work, let's say, to rewire them. So they have a better, more adaptive set of threat responses for the life they want to lead. Okay. Now, the other thing I want to point out here is it's kind of funny that Abigail Schrier uses this example of, like, you need anxiety, otherwise you'd get killed when you were crossing the road, right? It's kind of funny she uses that example because I used to, before the pandemic, I used to see people one-on-one. I now only see people one-on-one when I'm working up at the university, but people used to come to my home, and I live in the West End of Edinburgh. And that means in order to get to my home, in order to work with me, people would have to make their way through the city. And one of the last things they would need to do is cross the intersection outside of my apartment, right? Now it's right in the corner there. There's a tram that goes through. There are cars that come in from different directions. There's Deliveroo bike riders who have got these electric bikes that they've hacked and they seem to do like 80 miles per hour and zoom through, and they've been doing 48-hour shifts and are half asleep on the bikes. Anyway, it's a personal grievance. But there's threats coming from all over the place. Now, when people would come in, a lot of people would come in looking to work with me on their anxiety or their fears or whatever, and I would often say to them, I said, did you cross the road there? Did you cross the intersection before you came in? And they say, well, yes, I did. I say, let me ask you this. Were you anxious or afraid as you did so? Now, the vast majority, there was one exception to this, but the vast majority of people that I've worked with would say no. And I said, well, you know, that's interesting. How come you managed to cross the road safely? I mean, there was a lot of danger out there, legitimate, real danger. How come you're able to cross the road safely without fear or anxiety? And they go, ah. And of course, they're not sure. Now, I have an answer to this, of course. I'm not going to set up a question that is unanswerable. The reason they have the ability to do that is because they have the ability to coordinate themselves appropriately within that context, right? Now, so those who say, right, oh, you know, we don't want to necessarily like worry too much about threat response systems because they're just there keeping us safe anyway. They are there as a default to keep us safe, okay? And what they tend to do is they tend to stop us most of the time. Sometimes if you look at fight, flight, freeze, hide, avoid, submit, sometimes they'll drive us to fight. Sometimes they will drive us to move towards something, but in a very simplistic and aggressive way. Sometimes, but the rest of the time, they shut us down or have us flee. Okay, so if you think about this, if you think about the modern world in which we live, it's a complex world. And if we want to go out there and engage with it and create with it, which is what we are all charged with, you see, the irony is the complex world we've created isn't a simple jungle. It's complex and it requires our higher intelligence, our creative intelligence to engage with it if we want to be able to create a lot of options and a lot of choices for us in the world. So we need this higher ability to coordinate. We don't want to be pulled into our threat response systems constantly, especially if it's needless. Okay, and there are reasons why the modern complex world fires off a lot of fears. It's because our left hemisphere likes to have certainty about things. You know those old maps they had, you know, they'd had the known world and outside there be dragons. There's a kind of archetypal thing within that, let's say, that what tends to happen is we human beings, when we haven't got certainty around something, we kind of put dragons or we put fears into the gaps, into the spaces. Okay, now in the modern complex world, there's a lot of things that we're not entirely sure about. And if we have a tendency to put dragons into all of them, imaginary dragons, then we can end up hanging back and laying low. So part of rewiring your threat response systems for the modern world so that you can stride out into the world and create with it, create good results, is to create maps of self and maps of the world that give you what you need, give you a sort of certainty in dealing with uncertainty, right? That even when you don't know what's going to happen, you know how you're going to coordinate yourself. Because this is the most important thing. I would say right now, our threat response systems are there as a sort of factory setting, you could say, like they're the defaults. So while our threat response systems are a product of millions of years of evolution, I don't know the timeline on it, so are our higher functions, right? And I would argue right here that our threat response systems are there to keep us safe until we have got what we need to transcend them. And ideally, we want to transcend them. Let me say why. So Abigail Shrier talks about crossing the road. I would say no, most people cross the road, fine. If somebody flew in from the jungles of Borneo, okay, to work with me, or was flown in from the jungles of Borneo, some hill tribe or something, and they'd never seen the quote-unquote civilized world, they may experience a lot of fear with these cars flying around and these Deliveroo bikes and all of this stuff. They may experience a lot of fear, and it would be a good thing for them because it would help keep them safe, right? It might not help them realize their intention, which would be to cross the road and come and see me, right? But it would keep them safe, okay? So it does have a role. But if we have our threat response systems maladaptive, they would just end up having us lay low, hang back, hide, run away a lot, and occasionally when we're cornered, fight. Okay, and this is often not an adaptive thing for the modern world. So yes, threat response systems in aggregate are adaptive. They were probably evolved to fit better with a simpler world, that is the world of the hunter-gatherer. We were bequeathed through the same processes that gave us those a higher set of functions that we can use to transcend. And that is the aim, is to transcend our threat response systems, right? And indeed, we need to do that to manage the modern world. But we do not want to become utterly free. There are times when it is useful. And this is something that Abigail Shrier and Joe Rogan point at here. It can sharpen us up. But we need our threat response systems to be adaptive in that they are only sharpening us up, say before we do something, and not having us run away or taking us offline. So I mentioned the selective mutism instance. That isn't being sharpened up by fear or anxiety if the brain shuts down, and the speech centers just go offline and one cannot speak. That is not sharpening somebody up. That is a maladaptive threat response. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with that person morally or in terms of their character or anything like that. It just means things have got wired up in a certain way. And if people would say to me, yes, James, but can you do anything about that? Yes, of course you can do a lot about that. Is it easy to do something about that? No, you have to know what to do. You have to know how to approach it. You have to be willing to do it. But we are highly adaptive. We are neuroplastic. Our brains are neuroplastic. So we can transcend that. I have worked with many, many people. I work with people all the time doing this. So yes, in a general sense, we can say fear keeps us safe, right? But when we start to look at this modern world in which we live and we go, well, how is it that I need to be showing up and engaging with this? And these threat response systems are maladaptive for the modern world, the way we've got them wired up, then they're no longer serving us. They're no longer keeping us safe. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with us. It just means that there's a little bit of work to do if we want to be able to change the way we show up and engage in the world. And that's beneficial to do. Okay, yes, it can keep us sharp. But like Joe Rogan gives the example of the MMA fighters, the MMA fighter wants to sharpen themselves up before they step into the octagon. But when they step into the octagon, they need to click out of threat response and into flow, right? And flow is a high level ability to coordinate yourself within a context and act effectively. Okay, that is no longer fear driven. So the fear wants to be there at the start. If I'm a musician, I might want to have maybe a little bit of anxiety before I start performing, but if I don't go into flow when I perform, that anxiety will mess with my performance. It will undermine my fine motor skills. I won't be able to play my guitar well if I stay in fear or anxiety. So it is absolutely true. It's not a simple case of fear good, fear bad. Right? There's nuance to this. It's our threat response systems, how we have them wired. Do we have them wired for them to optimally support us in living the life that we want to live? That, for me, is the key. So if you've been watching this video, if you've got some value from this video so far, please do give it a thumbs up. I'm aware that I'm not giving you answers in this video, right? This is a conversation, but if you have questions, you can use the comment section below to ask those questions, and then perhaps we can, unfold the conversation going forward. If you're looking at yourself and your own life and you're thinking, actually, I'm not sure that my threat response systems are well adapted. I am hanging back where I would like to stride forward, right? I am laying low, I am hiding, I am playing it safe, or whatever it will be, right? And you're looking to rewire those. You might be interested in the Creating Courage and Fearlessness program, which I've got coming up. I don't want to be leaning too heavily into kind of plugging that here, but I do want to mention it because it is relevant. I'll just say something about that as well. Creating Courage and Fearlessness. I had a little bit of a discussion on YouTube about that with somebody, sort of possibly ongoing. And they're saying they choose courage over fearlessness every time because fear keeps us safe, right? Fear is an adaptation. But I would say to that, maybe I'll do a separate video on this as well, that fearlessness is about unhooking fears in inappropriate contexts. It's not about eradicating any ability to feel fear. And courage is about those moments like Joe Rogan's talking about. The MMA fighter, yeah, they want to feel a bit of anxiety ahead of time, but they also need the courage to cut through that and get to the flow, right? So courage is about when the fear kicks in. It's about allowing yourself to be sharpened by it, but not stopped by it. You need, in that instance, courage to cut through, right? And sometimes you need courage to just push through and move to what's on the other side of the fear, which oftentimes when you use courage to move through fear, that fear itself becomes a forge for creating more strength for you. So there's a role for courage and there's a role for fearlessness, although this video was largely about threat response systems and the like. Okay, so if you got some value from this, please do share it with anybody who might be interested. Please do give it a thumbs up. And obviously, as I've already said, please do ask any questions you have in the comments below. And beyond that, I look forward to when we next connect.